For a brief moment, forget supermarkets, refrigerated trucks, and online deliveries. In the early 1940s, entire nations woke up to empty shelves, ration books, and the quiet realization that food security had become a personal responsibility. Across Europe, Britain, and even parts of North America, families survived not because of government handouts, but because they remembered how to farm without stores. What kept them alive were simple, disciplined farming tricks passed down quietly, refined under pressure, and later forgotten when abundance returned. These methods were not romantic or experimental. They were proven under wartime scarcity, and they still work today. How wartime families turned every scrap of land into productive soil. One of the most important lessons from WWII farming was the refusal to waste space. Families planted wherever sunlight touched ground. Backyards, alleyways, rooftops, bomb craters, rail embankments, and even window boxes became food producers. The trick was shallow-root crops like lettuce, onions, carrots and beets grown intensively rather than traditionally spaced. Today, this can be applied by using raised beds, containers, or narrow strips along fences and driveways. The wartime rule was simple. If it gets 6 hours of sun, it grows food. Why calorie density mattered more than variety during shortages. Wartime farmers did not grow for flavour or novelty. They grew for calories per square foot. Potatoes, turnips, cabbage, beans and squash dominated because they stored well and delivered energy. Families planned crops backward from winter needs, not summer taste. A modern household can apply this by calculating how many calories a garden actually produces, rather than how many plants it contains. A small plot of potatoes can replace dozens of low-yield crops when food access becomes uncertain. How soil was rebuilt without fertilizers or garden centers. Chemical fertilizers were scarce or non-existent during the war. Families rebuilt soil using compost, wood ash, crushed eggshells, manure and green cover crops. Kitchen scraps were never discarded. Even paper was composted. One common practice was trench composting, where scraps were buried directly in garden rows months before planting. This same approach works today, particularly for urban growers who want long-term soil fertility without store-bought inputs. You know, back then, seed saving was treated as a real survival skill, not just some weekend hobby. Wartime families, well, they understood that seeds meant independence. They'd save seeds from the strongest plants and share those locally adapted varieties with neighbours. Hybrid seeds? Those were usually avoided, since you just couldn't rely on them for replanting. These days, applying that old wisdom means growing open-pollinated varieties and, learning a few basic seed harvesting methods. Honestly, a single tomato plant, if you pick carefully, can give you seeds for years, so you don't have to keep buying new ones every season. So, staggered planting, right? That was a clever way to prevent total crop failure. Instead of planting everything at once, families would spread out their sowing over several weeks. It was a way to guard against unpredictable weather, pests, even bombing damage, believe it or not. If one batch failed, another might pull through. These days, gardeners can use the same approach by planting small batches every 2 or 3 weeks. It really does boost resilience and stretches out the harvest, all without needing any more land. Mixed crops now, they were a bit of a secret weapon. Monoculture rows? Those were pretty rare in wartime gardens. Folks interplanted crops to throw off insects and keep diseases at bay. You'd see beans climbing among corn, greens tucked under taller plants, and herbs scattered here and there as natural pest deterrents. These days we call it companion planting, but back then it was just common sense. Using this method today, you can cut down on pests without chemicals and get the most out of whatever space you've got. Now, let's talk about how families managed to preserve their harvests without any electricity or freezers. You know, food preservation was just as important as growing the crops themselves. Drying, fermenting, root cellaring and pickling, these were daily practices, really part of everyday life. Root vegetables, for example, were often stored in sand or sawdust to keep them fresh. Cabbage was transformed into sauerkraut, and apples would be sliced and dried near the warmth of the stove. Even today, these old methods can help reduce our dependence on refrigeration and make it possible to store food during power outages. Honestly, just learning one preservation method can, well, double the value of a harvest. So, why did small livestock quietly fill those protein gaps, you might wonder? Well, rabbits, chickens, and sometimes even pigeons were raised discreetly in urban areas. They needed very little feed and honestly produced a reliable source of protein. Families would feed them scraps from the garden and, weeds too. These days, the modern equivalent might be backyard chickens, where it's legal, or maybe rabbits for both meat and manure. These systems, they convert waste into food so efficiently, just like they did during the war. Now, let's talk about how shared labour often replaced money in those tough times. Neighbours would exchange labour instead of cash. One family might handle the digging, another would take care of the harvesting, and yet another might do the preserving. Tools were shared around, not really owned by anyone individually. This kind of informal cooperation, it allowed families to get by without needing stores or much income. Today, you can see this idea in informal skill exchanges or shared gardens, especially when times get tough economically. It's discipline, not innovation, that truly kept families alive. Perhaps the most overlooked lesson is that wartime farming worked because people stuck to their routines. Gardens were tended to every single day. Waste was carefully monitored. Harvests? Well, they were planned months ahead. It was this discipline, not just clever tricks, that ensured survival. Modern preparedness, honestly, often falls short because it relies too much on novelty instead of good old consistency. These World War II farming tricks weren't lost because they stopped working. No, they were forgotten simply because they worked too well, quietly fading away when convenience returned. If you care about history, self-reliance and, proven survival knowledge, this is the sort of wisdom that's worth preserving and passing on. If this guide has added value to your understanding of the past and its lessons for today, do subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who values practical history, and, stay tuned for more forgotten knowledge that once fed entire families when the shops disappeared.